Welcome to this Geneva platform for resilient value chains expert discussion. Today we will be discussing the impacts of US trade defense measures, notably tariffs on imports of solar panels from China. A little bit of background on the Geneva platform for resilient value chains. We were set up to help ensure that clean energy supply chains will be reliable. Will installers of solar and wind, will purchasers of electric vehicles and batteries be able to get the equipment they need at a good price, reliably when they need it and without delay. And one of the biggest issues within the clean energy sector has been around solar panels, which have seen their deployment, their installation mushroom over the last few years across the world. And then when we look at some of the barriers to those supply chains, one thing keeps coming up, especially in the context we have today in early 2025, and that's about trade measures. Notably, will countries put tariffs on those panels for their imports? And we've seen tariffs in countries, including the United States. So today, I'm absolutely delighted to be here with our expert, Abdallah Alshamali. He's an international solar expert who I know has been involved in policy, in project development, and has had the time to do some in-depth studies on some of these impacts of trade measures. Welcome, Abdallah. I'd like to hear just a little bit more about yourself before we get into the subject matter today.
First of all, thank you very much for hosting me. This is a very important topic, and I'm glad that we can have the chance to have a conversation about it. I'm Abdallah Alshamali. I am a climate energy policy professional. I've been working 10 years in the general energy policy sphere, but also more focused on solar, working with developing solar projects, big utility scales, and working with different industry associations in different regions and internationally.
Thanks, Abdullah. And I know you're joining us today from Amman in Jordan, and Jordan's had a lot of success on pushing forward with renewables, including solar in recent years.
Yeah, that's very true. We are blessed with the sun. We're utilizing this and we're ramping up. We're one of the top performing countries in the Arab world in terms of renewable energy penetration, but of course, especially solar, because we have a lot of it and we're trying to use it.
I think you did a master's last year. And what was the question you were looking to investigate within that?
Yes, I did a master's on energy transition and governance. I did the master's in the Centre International de Formation Européenne, which is also called the European Institute in Nice, France. My whole work was supervised by Dr. Rachel Guyet. So my thesis was on the trade defense measures of the US and their impact on the solar industry. I thought this is going to be a very interesting topic because now there's a global wave of people discussing tariffs. We had these discussions in 2011-10, but now we're having again. So I thought we really need a better understanding of what is going on and what is the argument with or against these measures.
One of your areas of expertise has been on the US solar sector, and it was at the forefront of development of solar in the early days, I believe.
Yes, that's very true. I mean, solar PV, by the way, when we're talking about solar, maybe we should just say that we're talking about solar PV photovoltaic. And the US were the pioneers in that, in terms of commercializing it and using it in different applications. It started mid-20th century in applications like space exploration, satellites, slowly made its way into commercial. Until late 20th century, the US was the lead manufacturers around the world. But that changed later to other regions, other countries, mainly Asia.
When we were talking about the US leadership in the solar sector, I think the solar sector was a lot smaller then in terms of the amount that was installed each year.
Oh yeah, definitely. It was basically nothing compared to what we are seeing today. So the entire global solar installment didn't reach the 1 gigawatt until very late of the 20th. In some countries, we could see daily maybe 1 gigawatts. We crossed the 2 terawatt threshold just at the end of last year. And that was installed, like 1 complete terawatt was installed in 2 years. So we reached the threshold of 1 terawatt in 2022, and then the threshold of 2 terawatt in 2024. So now we're experiencing a much different growth than, let's say, early days of solar experience, of course.
And it was Japan for a while, and now it's China dominating the manufacture of these new panels that are going in such quantities.
Yes, that's very true. So in, let's say, beginning of 2010, I believe this was the really big shift in manufacturing all around the world. So the US slowly losing its share. Then we had Europe also coming in. They also had a good share, Europe and Japan. And then China started ramping up their own manufacturing until today. 85% of the global manufacturing across the different stages of solar PV panels is in China.
So there's been a huge change then away from the US dominating this market to becoming a rather minor player. But when we talk about solar photovoltaic, the way that the sun's energy can be turned into electricity, what are the elements in the solar supply chain? Which are the parts that are manufactured and that are important?
The main technology that I think we should focus on is crystalline silicon. There's two main types of technologies. There's thin films and the crystalline silicon. And crystalline silicon accounts to more than 97% of the entire solar PV around the world. And that's what China is usually doing. And the main components of the crystalline silicon, talking about polysilicon, which comes from the raw form of silicon, the quartz, and then from polysilicon, you create ingots. After the ingots, we have wafers, and then cells, and then eventually we end up with the modules, or you can call them panels. A lot of people think about the panels alone, but it's important when you're talking about supply chains, of course, that we consider all of these different elements because they are very important, even in terms of who holds most of manufacturing. China is dominant in all different stages. So they have the most shares of polysilicon, ingots, wafers, cells, and panels around the world. There's more diversification in models. This is the most diversified part of the supply chain.
So it's a long and involved process with a lot of techniques from mining to very high level precision engineering.
Definitely. There's a lot of investments going on in all of these different segments. The share of China is related to also economies of scale. They scaled up all of these different elements.
So you've noted on a couple of occasions already the dominance of China across this supply chain. Is the US producing its own needs, at least, for these elements?
Currently, there's a turning point in terms of how the US is meeting their own needs. The turning point is the Inflation Reduction Act that was enacted by the Biden administration. It has a lot of incentives for manufacturing. So before that, it was very difficult for the US. It didn't meet their own demands from panels, which was most of their local manufacturing. Ingots, wafers, and cells, basically, they couldn't meet any demand for that. For polysilicon, partially, yes. But now, post the Inflation Reduction Act and with the different incentives for manufacturing, we're now seeing a ramp up in their local potential. And they now can meet their demand, at least from models, let's say this year. And later on, there's a projection that they can exceed their own demand.
Okay, so it's been the Inflation Reduction Act that's been changing the ability of the US to meet its own demands, and that is a set of industrial policies and incentives. When was the Inflation Reduction Act enacted?
It was in 2022, and it took some time for a lot of different parts of it to be in action, and also for the beneficiaries to step up and basically invest into the different manufacturing steps.
Interesting, because I think a lot of the studies that you did was looking at the trade defense measures in the period before the Inflation Reduction Act. What have they been? I know that the US has put in import tariffs at various times, but what have the trade defense measures been, and when were they put in place?
Trade defense measures, we use it as a term to describe the different policies or actions by governments to protect their domestic from either unfair competition, from disruptions. Basically, it's a way to control also the imports. And the intention usually is to protect a certain industry. And in our case, is the solar PV industry. And there's different types of these policies, different types of tariffs. And one of them we call anti-dumping, which is tariffs imposed on goods that are thought to be sold below their real value. And there's measures, which is also known as anti-subsidy. So then there's a certain product that is subsidized in its home country and then sold in another country, then there might be measures to level out the playing field. And then there's safeguard measures, which are usually temporary. If there's a certain spike in imports of a certain product, some countries would like to install safeguard measures to limit the impact of this influx of products to not disturb or sometimes suffocate the local products. So these are in general the description of the trade defense measures that we can see all around the world. In the US case, these trade defense measures started in 2012. Back then, there was a wave of these different trade defense measures because that's when the Chinese industry was thriving. There was a lot of production, and then there was a lot of export happening. It flooded different markets. So that's in 2011. And then 2012, we started seeing these measures that started with the Biden administration. The first measures were anti-dumping and countervailing tariffs. And then in 2014, we expanded the tariffs and other investigations. And then in 2018, there was also safeguard measures on different imports. In 2022, we had another stage of expanding the previous trade defense measures that was by the Biden administration. And there's also another kind of limiting of imports, which was through the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. It was a policy against the use of forced labor in certain region in China. And there's many products, and one of these products is solar PV. So by that policy enacted in the US, it's also limited certain Chinese products, including solar PV, to enter the US. So you can consider that as also as a safeguard, but it's a limiting of import of sort.
So how did these trade defense measures in the US come about? And what was the rationale for their introduction? Were there proponents and dissenting voices?
This is a very interesting question because in global discussions, usually it's been seen as it's government against government, but the interactions are much more complex. There are more parties involved, and these different parties are the manufacturers of panels, whether it was the Chinese manufacturers or other countries or the local manufacturers inside the US. And you also have a very important party, which is the installers and developers. They have different interests in how they see these cheap and abundant models that comes from abroad. The manufacturers, in 2011, they started to feel a big pressure in the market. They started losing their market share to the cheaper Chinese models. Of course, that means that basically the business is infected. So a protectionism wave started in 2011. There have been lobbying and there have been calls to enact these tariffs. And the way they start in the US, there's an internal system where they complain to the Department of Commerce, and then there's an investigation. And when the investigation is taking place, it can decide if there's actually been dumping or other injustice to the local market. The investigations usually led to that there is dumping happening in the market, the production is subsidized, and so they decided on these different trade defense measures.
That's really interesting. In effect, what happens is that some of the companies are saying, look, we're losing business to the imports. They're too cheap. They've been unfairly subsidized or supported by China or by other countries. They raise a complaint with the Department of Commerce and they launch their own investigation, make a decision, and the tariffs come from there. So it's not coming from the government itself. It's coming from the companies who are saying that we're struggling here.
Exactly. Most cases, it's not initiated by the government. There are some cases where the government, like within the powers of the president of the US, he can maybe install some safeguard measures. But the tariffs themselves on solar PV initiated by the manufacturers, and not even all of them. It's usually a coalition of a couple manufacturers. And one case, there was only one company that created a big market disruption because they applied for an investigation.
That's incredible. And then you mentioned as well earlier, the developers, the installers of projects, they weren't so happy with the tariffs, a lot of them, because that put the prices up and that meant their market was eroded. Did they complain within these processes and were they listened to?
There has been campaigns to basically advocate for either removal of the tariffs, reducing them, or stopping incoming tariffs from happening. And this we're talking about also different industry associations on solar PV, different coalitions from the installers and developers to counter that. Yes, they were not happy. The prices went up. There was disruptions on the import patterns, investments may be lost, and we can talk about the impacts. But there will have definitely been opposition to these tariffs from the industry side and also from the government side. There has been also attempts from the US US senators, even Biden at some point intervened to lift the impact of some of the tariffs because, as he said, it was an act of national emergency and he needed the solar imports from different countries to come to the US.
Now, that's fascinating. So there's a whole range of interlinked impacts here, both on US manufacturers, US installers, and of course the manufacturers from other parts of the world as well, who will see their markets going down. Looking at some of these impacts in particular, how did the tariffs affect imports from China?
They were definitely successful in reducing them. Imports from China is now reduced to barely any noticeable share of the entire imports. They were successful, at least, into avoiding Chinese products, but that just made the dependence on other countries. Now, most of the imports come from Southeast Asian countries, and the import is actually increased. The solar PV imports in total increased since the start of these tariffs.
The trade defense measures, they have reduced the imports from China, and we've seen stronger imports from other countries in Asia and elsewhere. But has it led to a big growth in the US manufacturing sector, which I think is one of the other key things that we've been looking for from these trade defense measures?
This is the very interesting part. So what the tariffs were, let's say, not necessarily designed to, but what they were supposed to do did not actually take place. It did not create an enabling environment for the manufacturing industry. Between 2012 and 2017, which a lot of the tariffs were enacted, 25 solar manufacturers closed down. They closed business. And the import of cells, models surged by 500%. The prices dropped by more than 60%. Wafer production completely stopped in 2014. Cell production completely stopped in 2020. The polysilicon production also dropped by 2/3. So the tariffs did not really help in incentivizing the local manufacturing. The cheap imports kept happening. There's still an influx from cheaper panels. All these tariffs, all these measures didn't incentivize the local production. They did, however, incentivize thin film production in the US, because one of the most active advocates for the tariffs, it's a company that's manufacturing thin film. So that worked in their favor, and especially because thin film does not rely on the entire supply chain. So that was an advantage. They don't need wafers, they don't need ingots and cells. They manufacture it locally. Other manufacturers, they were hurt. So even the manufacturers that advocated for these tariffs, they were hurt by these tariffs themselves because they still needed inputs. For example, if they are panel manufacturers, they were not vertically integrated like in the Chinese sector. So they needed the cells and they needed the wafers, and they were more expensive for them. So they couldn't compete even locally as well. So that's led to more closure.
Now, what a fascinating story. And you mentioned then the thin film alternative technology. Is that used a lot in the US, and are there other exports of it as well?
Export-wise, still the world is being dominated by crystalline silicon. So it's 97% or more crystalline silicon. But because of different measures, it created a good business case for thin film locally in the US. I think around maybe 30% or more of utility scale solar PV in the US is made from thin films. And this is significant. This doesn't exist necessarily in any other country, but it's what the environment of trade defense measures created that enabled using this technology.
And you mentioned before as well that the manufacturers of solar cells, solar panels in the US depend on imports of polysilicon or wafer or ingots from other parts of the world. And I think one of the fears about trade defense measures is if I put a trade defense measure on you, you might put one on me. Tariffs and other measures on Chinese and other imports. Was there any retaliation?
Yeah, definitely. These barriers, at the end, they increase tension. It's increased political tension. It also trade tension. And that's what happened also in the case between China and the US. After the US enacted the trade defense measure, China retaliated by having their own trade defense measure against polysilicon manufactured in the US. And they reduced the US share of global polysilicon significantly after this move. But not just there. Until today, there's still a lot of disputes. It's requests, it's investigations that were initiated by China in the World Trade Organization. These disputes are still ongoing, unresolved. So basically creating trade wars, as some people call.
One of these policies that the US has been following in trade a lot recently has been saying the trade surplus between China and the US is too high. We need to reduce that. And they've been looking at particular sectors and putting in trade defense measures and so on. Has the US tariffs and other defense measures on the import of solar panels, has that changed China's strategy of export-led growth?
No, not really. Who are the main parties involved? So we're talking about the Chinese manufacturers that are directly involved in these tariffs. So they are the one affected. Their businesses that the one are being affected. How did they react? Basically, they still rely on economies of scale and export. What they did is that when they saw the tariffs that were just on Chinese models, they had incentives to invest in other countries. So that's led to a lot of investments in countries in Southeast Asia, which then became the biggest share of exporters to the US, which is still Chinese companies, but from different countries. And the Chinese government also did not change the way they support, or their industrial policy in general, supporting their solar PV with subsidies and other mechanisms.
The US hasn't been the only country that's put tariffs on imports of Chinese solar. I think the EU at various times, and India in particular, have they had similar impacts? Have they seen similar things as what we've seen with the US?
Yes, there's a lot of parallels we can draw. The EU started at around the same time as the US, but the cost of producing solar PV is much higher than it is in the US, and their dependence on the Chinese model were much higher than it was in the US. So when they enacted the tariffs, they completely suffocated their own market. The same impacts that we can see in the US happen in the EU, but on a much bigger scale. And only after the EU lifted these trade defense measures, that the industry in the EU started to come back to life. In India, it's a different case. In India, it's much cheaper than the US and EU to produce panels locally. And they have less dependent on Chinese models. When they had their own trade defense measures, they were not impacted as much. Their own solar market is decoupled from Chinese products, but that's not the case for the US, and that's not the case for the EU. But the US still managed to have a solar industry slightly growing because it had local alternatives and because of the cost difference.
If that difference in production cost between the countries is too high, those trade measures won't be effective. If the difference is relatively low, then there's possibility that local manufacturing can gain a foothold and can grow. So on the basis of that, what would you advise other countries? And I know other countries at the moment around the world are also considering potentially manufacturing more of parts of the solar chain at least, and potentially bringing in tariffs to help grow those industries and to help protect those industries. What would you advise them to do based on your experience?
First of all, maybe they should really think if they need to go there from a global industry perspective. Does everyone need to be manufacturing panels? It's not going to work for everyone. You need a lot of different criteria to make the business case. But if it's a matter of national energy security or regional energy security, then you can think of, first of all, of how you reduce the costs. So really understanding where the costs come from and then trying to reduce them. This needs, of course, a sound industrial policy. This needs government intervention to be able to make the business case. So investors by their own, it will be very hard to really compete with the global capacity we have today. And I would advise against these trade defense measures, because what they do is they put barriers on the market. They put barriers on growing our solar capacity. And this is something we don't need. This is something we cannot afford at this time. We're trying to reduce the carbon footprint. We're trying to really increase renewable energy. So we don't need to put barriers on installing solar panels. So this is why trade defense measures is a bad technique. What we need to do is try to solve how can we really incentivize local manufacturing by addressing the costs issues that a lot of these different manufacturers face, to support them in achieving national energy security goals. We talked about how trade defense measures in some countries had different impacts. Some countries may have some benefits, but that has to be studied really well. So in the case of the US and the EU, it didn't really have any substantial benefits. But in other cases, it could have. That means to basically have a sound trade policy or trade defense measures that doesn't limit the installment of the local market. And second, there has to be a good stakeholder engagement process to not allow one company, two companies, a coalition of a couple of companies to basically impact an entire industry. So having a good stakeholder engagement to see where does the impact really impact the industry? Does the industry really needs these measures or not? This is also very important. So revision of the trade regulations and investigations is very important.
So to some extent, we're in a situation where there's a trade-off between climate ambition, which means installing as many solar panels as we can, as quickly as we can, and local manufacturing ambitions. It's going to be very difficult for many countries to really get a share of that market. And they need, therefore, cost reduction measures, and they need to really think carefully about industrial policy.
Definitely. And I would add that if we want to increase jobs in the solar industry, and we want to increase our capacity, and we also to increase our energy security by installing more solar PV, we really don't need the trade defense measures. We don't need tariffs for that.
There's typically a lot more jobs then in installing and maintaining solar panels than there is in manufacturing them. And we need to weigh up the two benefits of those for an economy when we're looking at trade defense measures, at tariffs and otherwise. Is there a possibility as well of encouraging some assembly of solar panels in countries? I know that some of the processes, mining the quartz and making the wafers through the ingots and then making the cells, can be very high tech, very high investment costs needed to get into that part of the industry. But assembly plants, is that an option for countries?
Most countries, what they have is assembly plants outside of China. So most of them are just assembly plants producing just panels. And any country wants to have a local supply chain, they should start with the panels. And then from there, with economies of scale, with the right sizes, they can seek more vertical integration later on.
Okay, and I think we saw that in the India case where the import tariffs on cells were lower than on panels as a way to try and encourage that move firstly into the assembly side.
Definitely. And at the end, it will take a global effort to make the global energy transition happen. We should really think globally. There are going to be some challenges, of course, and there's going to be different priorities between different regions. But at the end, we need a global energy transition. To make that happen, we need global cooperation, especially on solar PV trade. And this includes exchange of technology, of knowledge, and the ease of trade.
So we've heard that the impact on the US manufacturing industry from the trade defense measures, from the tariffs, wasn't enough to create new jobs. And indeed, many companies went out of business during that period. What about the other impacts on solar in the US?
Basically losing business. It means some plants, they just closed down, which means there's loss of jobs. And that was one of the main points why these tariffs were installed, why a lot of people were in favor on the political sphere. When people are advocating for tariffs or like to basically favor the local products, it's usually saving local jobs. But that didn't take place. It was the opposite. Manufacturing jobs were lost. It was reduced by 12% since the tariffs were installed, but there was still a growth in jobs. But that was not in manufacturing. That was in the downstream sector with installment, development, different supportive industries, and that's where most of the jobs were created. But manufacturing actually lost jobs. If there was no trade defense measures, first of all, we would see more growth in the installment of solar PV, in the installed capacity. It is noticeable that after every trade defense measures has been enacted, that the growth has shrunk. So if there was no trade defense measures, we would have more installed capacity, which means there will be more jobs for the people in the solar PV industry. Of course, we see also other impacts, and the main impacts is related to costs and investments. It is evaluated that there has been a loss of maybe 19 billion investments just between 2017 and 2021. And these investments, of course, related to loss of potential solar PV projects, Why? Because basically, from an investment point of view, you have fluctuation in costs. There's also the matter of the availability of models. At certain points, models might not be available to the cost that businesses were trying to evaluate the project's profitability, and even also in the import patterns. So all of these creates market uncertainty. With market uncertainty, this is not really good for investments. Overall, stagnated solar in the US. It's going to be an important couple of years. Why? Because it's a true test to the Chinese industry and how strong they are financially. Are they going to survive the bubble that they are in? Is it going to burst and then a lot of companies are just going to collapse? There is a lot of companies already struggling, and the issue of overcapacity has been discussed over and over again. Basically, we have overcapacity, but that's also true for any national regional efforts to create their own supply chains, because this will increase the problem of overcapacity. And still, there's more support now that we see in the US, in the EU, for local manufacturing as well. Will it be able to compete at this critical time? So these are a lot of questions that I don't know the answer for, but it's going to be interesting to see the folding of market dynamics. But eventually, that's what we need to try to do. We need to keep the wheel of solar PV going. So that's why I said global cooperation is really important. Yeah. We cannot do this alone. No country, no region can do it alone. So we need cooperation, definitely. We need energy security, definitely. But you have to do it together.